Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. Happy Tuesday. How are you? Thank you so much for joining us today for the Hunt Institute's Race and Education webinar on Latinx identity on college campuses, not a monolith. We have a really wonderful discussion for you all today, and we're so grateful that you've decided to spend an hour with us talking about the needs of our Latinx students, talking about how we can transform our higher education system to better support those students, and also the tools, policies, best practices that our policymakers can put in place to help support this growing group of students and this growing and talented student demographic. So thank you all so much. We have a really awesome discussion for you all, led by Melanie Godinez-Cedillo, the Hunt Institute's John M. Belk Impact Fellow, Armando Rodriguez, trustee at the Continuum Independent School District, Dr. Deborah Santiago, CEO of Excelencia in Education, and moderating today's discussion is Paul Luna, President and CEO of the Helios Education Foundation. Before we begin, I want to give huge shout outs to the team behind the scene that made this awesome webinar happen. Thank you to Lucy, thank you to Abigail, thank you to Michelle, to Jen, to Sophie, for all of your hard work putting together an awesome event, celebrating our students and helping tune our educators, to our policymakers, tune our administrators to what needs to happen to support them. And also thank you immensely to all of you who have tuned in for today's discussion. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your ideas, your engagement, your thoughts throughout today's conversation. So please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, post your comments, share your thoughts about today's conversation. And also, if you're following along on Twitter, please make sure to use the hashtag race and education. Again, use the hashtag race and education during today's conversation so that we can hear your comments online and so that we can continue to create great resources and great ideas that help you in your field and in your practice change policy for our most vulnerable students. And I also want to say that in the last 10 years, the number of Hispanic serving institutions has grown by 93%, increasing from 230 to now above 539 institutions. This growth tracks with the increase of the overall Latinx population in the United States, in turn fueling greater rates of matriculation in higher education. And in the wake of this 2020 election, where Latinx community members wrestled with articulating the nuanced differences within Latinidad, public calls to acknowledge the rich and diverse backgrounds that comprise the Latinx community have swelled. And that's really the crux of today's conversation. How can we better understand our Latinx students, their rich cultural heritage, their ideas, their demographics, their documentation status, and how can we best put in the supports needed? How can we best transform outcomes for these students? How can we rise up and tackle on the skills and abilities and talents that they have to make our institutions better at serving them? And with that, I want to turn it over to the wonderful President and CEO of the Helios Education Foundation, Mr. Paul Luna, to get our conversation started today. So thank you so much, Paul.
Well, thank you, Senegal. I appreciate it and want to extend my good afternoons and good mornings. Good morning from Arizona, but thank you to everyone who's joining our webinar today. I want to personally thank Senegal and the Hunt Institute and Javed and all the other partners and great individuals who work at the Hunt Institute, both publicly and behind the scenes. You all do such great work to bring these types of conversations to our community and really reflect great opportunities to engage in dialogue on how we all can improve, in this case, how we serve students, in particular Latinx students. So thank you for the great work that you all do, that you lead, the Hunt Institute overall, for the great programs that you provide. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today, both personally and on behalf of Helios. We're honored to be a part of this hearty conversation and something that we care deeply about. So as Senegal said, my name is Paul Luna. I'm the president and CEO of Helios Education Foundation. And we're a philanthropic organization that's focused principally on creating opportunities for individuals to succeed in post-secondary education. One of our fundamental beliefs that guides everything we do as an organization is this belief that every student regardless of background, regardless of where they were born, the color of their skin, how much money they have, who their parents are, where they live, who they love, that every student deserves a high quality education. And through our work, we're trying to help close student achievement gaps and increase post-secondary degree attainment, in particular among first-generation, low-income, traditionally underrepresented minority students. The work that we do is targeted specifically to Arizona and Florida. And in Arizona, in particular, we prioritize the Latinx community, as we recognize that nearly half of all of the students in the Arizona K-12 education pipeline are Latinx by culture and by background. And we're working to ensure that they and all students, as we say, are prepared to have the opportunity to pursue a post-secondary degree. And that's really at the heart of the conversation today, is how do we recognize and celebrate changing demographics that are realities around the country, and in particular in states like Arizona and others where Latinx communities are fastest growing demographic in the community. How do we work together to ensure that we're serving these students well? So I'm particularly interested in the conversation today as well, and the learnings that we all take from this. And thank our panelists for being here today. And so I'm going to transition very quickly into really giving the platform to them, so we can hear their perspectives. We have the pleasure of hearing from three very unique, distinguished voices and perspectives on the Latinx community and Latin students. So I'm going to turn over to our panelists, and I'm going to ask each of them to give a brief introduction of themselves, but really as well to respond to the following question to kind of get the conversation going. And the question is generally this: in your work and personal experience, how have you seen America's higher education institutions and systems recognize the diverse needs and experience of Latinx students? How does institutional recognition and support of their identity impact Latinx students' future educational, social, and career outcomes? So in short, why is this conversation important? And what do we need to know about Latinx students from your perspective? So I'm going to start with Armando, if that's okay, and ask if you might weigh in and speak to us from your perspective.
Yes, well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, the Hunt Institute and my colleagues on this panel, trying to help elevate our community. My name's Armando Rodriguez. I sit on the Canutillo School Board in El Paso, which is a border community. I'm currently an officer as a secretary treasurer for the Texas Association of School Boards, and I've rolled off as the past president of the Mexican American School Board Association, as well as the NALEO Board of Education. And I just rolled off as the NSBA Board of Director and now the past chair of the National Hispanic Council for NSBA. I graduated from UTEP with a degree in international business. I was able to experience a Hispanic Serving Institution with currently at an 83% Hispanic population. But one of the questions that one of my good friends, Rico Garcia, which is a deputy chief of staff for Congressman Vicente Gonzalez, but he's also the youngest legislative Latino staffer in America. We were trying to have this conversation on how we could enrich our Hispanic serving institutions, provide pretty much about the same experience that historically Black colleges and universities do. So being at UTEP, I felt there's so much more that higher ed systems can do for the most part, and can do much better. Not that it's failing, but it has a lot more room to grow. And how do we help grow that, right? And so I think it's important for us to help celebrate and elevate the successes of many of our people, whether it's current events or on a historical perspective. So that way our community and our students will be able to have that understanding and appreciation. So that way they would want to meet those. There's been in several of the organizations I've been part of, there's many people that have laid the foundation for us, but there's so much work still left and to help create a bigger foundation so that way we could help grow our community and elevate it. And so it's important for us to recognize where we come from and who we are and what we can contribute to our society, and be able to work with others to make a better environment for our youth, right? And for those to come. So I look forward to this conversation and see what what my colleagues have to say as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Armando, and thank you for the great work that you do in providing leadership as a school board member and obviously doing so many other things. So Melanie, let me ask you if you might weigh in and share your thoughts and tell us about yourself.
Definitely. Hi, I'm Melanie Delgado. I am currently a junior, well, now rising senior at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And for the past year, I have been a John M. Belk Impact Fellow working within the Hunt Institute on educational equity during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I am a Latina student here at UNC, and I also work within other organizations such as Mi Pueblo UNC, which is the largest Latinx organization here at Carolina. And I am the Latinx lead for the Community Empowerment Fund, which aims to promote financial literacy and support for members of the Orange County Chapel Hill community. And so to really discuss about how I've seen America's higher education institutions kind of recognize the needs of our diverse student body. I think that speaking from my experience as a UNC student, they do provide the space and opportunity for us to kind of ask questions. But as Armando said, there is room to grow. I feel like there is recognition of these needs and there is work being done. But I think that there is much more systemic level issues that need to be addressed, that also need to be uncovered, and that need to be more research. There needs to be more data collection on how we can best serve our students socially as well. I think our students have much more diverse needs because, as this panel is called, Latinx students are not a monolith. And as I've witnessed with my peers, we all have a wide variety of backgrounds and communities that we like to support. So I think that recognizing those needs is still an issue that a lot of American higher ed institutions need to address. But I do think that this issue is something that is prevalent in the minds. And so I think this panel will be a great opportunity for us to kind of discuss where the pockets and the gaps are for us to fill in.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. And the lady who needs no introduction amongst many of us, Deborah Santiago, please let me just turn it over to you.
Hi, Paul. Thank you.
Hello.
Thanks to the Hunt Institute. Good to see you all. So I'm Deborah Santiago. I'm the co-founder and chief executive officer for Excelencia in Education, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., 17 years young. And I so appreciate the question, Paul, of, kind of ultimately why it matters and what we've seen. I started writing my own notes and you said, like, over your career, what have you seen? I'm like, well, I have a long list. Unfortunately, I've been at it for a while, but I mean, I'll narrow it down to say this. The very reason we created this organization, Excelencia in Education, is because we found just a profound ignorance about our community. People didn't know. And, ignorance is not knowing. I have to say stupidity you can't do a lot about, but ignorance is not knowing. You can do something about that. And our commitment was to try and educate and inform, but also frame the conversation from one that's very asset-based, because so many of the conversations we saw in Washington, D.C. and on college campuses across the country were either very crisis mode or deficit-based. And I think as a Latina, I have to reject that negativity and think that there's something wrong with us or that we're not meeting some kind of norm. We are representative of what that norm is. So I think identifying Latinos, what does that mean for us? Latino is a political construct with people over 20 countries of origin. But I think what divides us, what describes us doesn't divide us. That's the focus of what institutions of higher ed are dealing with today, if they choose to acknowledge it. We work with institutions that are kind of indifferent and have been resistant, been challenged by it. And then we've got others that are very curious. They want to learn, they want to embrace it, they want to figure out how to better serve. Some of them, it's because they see we are the only growth population. And if they want to hit their enrollment management numbers, they've got to reach out to our community. That's very pragmatic. It's a little bit crass, but it's real. And then we have others that are embracing what it means to serve a diverse community and what it means to transform to make sure that they're serving the students of today and tomorrow rather than just the students of the past. So I've seen all of that in our efforts and strategies as an organization. I do think ultimately it boils down to, I think, two core questions, unapologetically bringing a Latino lens to what you do as an institution. That doesn't mean to the detriment of anybody else, but just a way of looking to make sure that what you're doing is serving this population amongst all. And if not, figuring out how to adjust and adapt to that. Those are the institutions that are committed to cause and doing well. And then I think the other is, a basic understanding of who you serve, who you don't serve, who you want to serve, and what it's going to take to serve them well. Whatever their background is, that defines an institution that's ready to take action or not. And I think that's the basis of this conversation, because there are some that will be resistant to the diversity and the beauty that is this population amongst all. And there are those that are ready to be the kinds of institutions where Latino students thrive. And that's where my interest is.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you to all our panelists. As I think the audience knows today, one of the things we want to do is get to a facilitation of audience Q&A, and we want to make this as interactive as we possibly can in this Zoom world of webinars. But before we go to the Q&A portion, I want to just dig a little deeper with each of our panelists and maybe ask a follow-up question and see if they might tell us just a little bit more about either building upon their initial comments or maybe even pivoting to a particular point that they want to share with us. But I'm particularly interested in starting with you, Melanie, as a student, a current student. Congratulations, a senior now, with so much ahead of you. You represent the Latinx student population that we're speaking specifically about how we better support. And so I want to ask if you might, share more about your experiences. You made mention to how at UNC Chapel here, there's been some recognition of the diverse needs of the Latinx community, and you've seen some of that happen. But the question really is, well, what still needs to be done? And even if it's not just at UNC, what from your student perspective, what needs to be done to better support and understand and assist students to success like you're achieving?
Definitely. I think I have to highlight the Carolina Latinx Center, which has been introduced recently within the past few years here at UNC, which is a space and, center for Latinx students for us to go and really learn and hopefully get more support from whatever we may need. And I think that has been an incredible support system for many of us Latinx students, especially during COVID. It's a place for us to gather more resources, learn about courses that we might be interested in, or, just have someone to talk to when when things are going rough, which I think is something that kind of is still a gap in higher education. There's a lot of focus on getting us to college and getting access, getting all these opportunities, which is really great and really important and definitely work that needs to be continued. But we have seen some gaps once we are in higher ed, how students struggle. I know I got an email as a representative of Mi Pueblo within the university about how students don't access the mental health system, or CAPS that we call it here. Latinx students don't access it at the same rates as other students. And why is that? And I think that is something that needs to be continued to be explored. And then the transfer rate is very high for our student population, which also needs to be explored. So I think that focusing on our student population, but our journey and our time within the institution itself is still really relevant and really important. And looking at all aspects of kind of campus life, like where we are living, how we are socializing, how we are adapting to the higher education climate is really important, especially within that first year of when you arrive to an institution. I think that transition period is really important to focus on, because I know as a first year student, that big transition period was a lot for me. And I think that is something that we definitely need to focus on as well.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, Melanie. I think that your statements probably resonate with so many of us, many of whom have been first generation students ourselves, or kind of part of a small Latinx minority community within our institutions we may have attended. And that sort of center concept, that safe place, that sharing of information is really, really important. So I want to kind of keep the focus on the educational institutions, the higher educational institutions. So Deborah, I want to pivot to you. As you mentioned, you've been in this space a long time. You've been working with many of these institutions across the country. You have a sense of, who you're having to convince as institutions why this is important in terms of serving our Latinx population better, as well as others who are really breaking down barriers in very positive ways. I wonder if you might speak to and kind of reinforce how policies at the higher educational institutions impact the way students succeed, and maybe sometimes bad policies continue to perpetuate equity gaps and challenges that Melanie spoke to. And so I wonder if you might share a little more your perspective and what we need to be doing in the higher education space, especially from a policy perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Just to build on some of what Melanie shared, I think so the focus from an institutional perspective, policy is about scale, right? So whether it's institutional or federal or state, taking a look at who the students are and what it takes to serve them well has to be what undergirds. Too often in policy, we have this traditional profile of students, of institutions and pathways. And those are things that can be limiting when you've got the dynamism of students of today who are swirling, stopping out, returning, given this pandemic, that are putting together an educational experience that meets their needs. And I know at Excelencia, so much of our focus is how do we help institutions transform to meet students where they're at, rather than trying to force students to adapt to these traditional ways in a structure that was not built for them, that perpetuates the inequities that existed before the students were there, and how we can figure to adjust it. I think policy plays a critical role in that, Paul. The ability to revisit what we're doing and asking why we're doing it, who is it helping, who is it not, and identifying what our student needs. That Excelencia well, Paul, we always focus on what are the data, what do they tell us about the profile of students, what the needs are and the opportunities to leverage their success. I think policy that's grounded in that and that is unafraid to ask the question, what does it mean when you disaggregate this by race, ethnicity, by income, by residency status, to make sure that we understand who the students are, allows us, creates space for our institutions to transform and create policy that is more intentional in serving the students that they claim they want to serve.
Yeah.
And if they're not doing that, then I think we have to call out the fact that there isn't that intentional focus on these students, and students are doing well despite the institution, not because of it. So policies that pay attention to diverse pathways, that leverage students' needs, things like cohort models that we know work very well for all students, but disproportionately for students from communities historically disenfranchised, things like that. We have lots of programs and practices. I won't go into those, Paul, but I do think that there is an awareness that nothing is sacrosanct when it comes to higher ed. We have to meet students where they're at. Those are the effective policies.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Deborah. And I appreciate those broad comments, but in particular, kind of I'll crystallize that I think really important foundational point of ensuring that our higher educational institutions are understanding and meeting the needs of our students where they're at, as opposed to, I think the historical construct has been helping students to redefine themselves into this historical model that everybody had to fit into, which hadn't always been an easy transition for students from our backgrounds. And so I think that's a really important point to acknowledge that we look at education, I know from a Helios perspective, as the full education continuum. Right? It's not just one aspect. Success doesn't just come in one aspect of the P20 education continuum. And it is really more of an ecosystem that we work within. So as you're speaking to the importance of the higher educational institutions meeting the students where they're at, it also brings to mind the importance of the education pipeline that feeds into the higher education institutions. And so with that, I want to transition to Armando and ask if maybe you might speak more to the work that you do as a school board member, and really reflecting on the work at the K-12 level, and how do we ensure that through the K-12 system, we're working with Latinx students to ensure that we're helping to prepare them academically, emotionally, socially, meeting them with their own unique cultural identities as they find their way into these higher educational institutions to better prepare them for future success. Armando, would you speak to kind of some of the work you're doing and why that's so important as well?
Well, there's a lot of work that has been done, and there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But looking at, it's important for us to build the capacity of our kids, right? For them to have a better understanding of where they come from and who they are, both on that would help at an academic and a socially perspective. But I think one of the most important things that we've done as a community in our school district is to make sure that we have high expectations. And those high expectations are for all students, and making sure that we instituted a requirement that all students were going to graduate from Continuum were going to apply to a university or college or a technical institute. And we started getting some heartfelt stories from some of our parents calling and saying, I didn't know my kid could do this. I didn't know he could go to UTEP, or there wasn't that opportunity. So it changed that perspective, right? But I think, and some of the stuff that, and if you look at some of the history, right, and within our communities, we've had issues where they weren't supported of dual language, right? And dual language, we know, allows our kids to grow, right? They have a cross-cultural understanding, they gain a mutual respect with their peers, and they have appreciation for themselves and for others. And the other is, of course, ethnic studies. I'm half Puerto Rican, half Mexican. I don't deny either one. I know who I am, and I know where I come from. And so I think it's important for our students to understand the history in our community, not in a deficit, and in a way that we've contributed to society and that they've hid from the textbooks. Then I'll go to something crazy, and it's happening across the country, but it's right now for discussion in our legislative session, where they're wanting to eliminate CRT. And so, early on when I was in high school and when I was in college, I didn't get that understanding of my culture. And so when I was able to grow both in this realm of a policymaker, I started learning who I was and where I came from. And I didn't need to negotiate my values, but I wanted to learn more about others, right? I went to Israel. I wanted to learn about both issues. And currently we're seeing some of those situations, but being able to understand what critical race theory is, to many of us, it's different, right? And so for me, like I said, this was past high school, but once I understood the social constructs of race, I was better able to understand how this society works and how we could work. I think for far too long, they've wanted us working in silos against each other. But I think being able to understand we could break some of those silos and bring people on. And so when I go into these organizations, I go so that way they could learn about my people, but at the same time, I want to learn more about them. And I think once we get an appreciation of our own culture and aspects, then we could also appreciate the diversity. And so I think that's the main goal, is how do we really grow as a society together? And it's just frustrating how people are slanting this in a way that, it's a negative. It's always a negative deficit or whatever they're trying to do. And it's like, no, we could grow a lot better if we had this conversation. As we know, race isn't rocket science. It's actually harder than rocket science. Why? Because we don't talk about it. And so we need to have these conversations, because for far too long, they've been neglected and have not been addressed within our communities.
Great. Very well said. And so thank you for that. Thank you for sharing, your perspective. I want to keep the conversation moving and transition into some of the questions that we're now getting from the audience, and kind of move into a Q&A. And so one of the first questions we've received kind of pivots a little bit, Armando, I think, on acknowledging, when you were talking about, your own understanding of your background and your ethnicity, and it speaks to that there's no one definition of Latinx, and there's multiple layers to each and every one of us as individuals. And I think this kind of speaks to that. So I'm going to ask the question. I don't know if, Armando, maybe you might be one to speak to this first. I'll see if anyone has any thoughts, but the question, and I'll read it because I want to do, I want to acknowledge the specific questions as it came in. So the question is, as we speak to the diverse needs of Latinx students, what are the unique needs of Latinx students with disabilities? What best practices have been identified to serve intersecting needs of ethnicity and ability? So I think it's acknowledgement, again, that there's no one individual is exactly the same. And in this case, a Latinx student with disabilities. And so what do we do to ensure we're serving all students in the best way we can? Any thoughts, Armando? Or I'll see if anyone else wants to speak in or speak up.
As a policymaker and as somebody that sets goals and holds the superintendent accountable, it's always important to include all students, and that includes special needs students, that includes limited English proficient students. That also includes, and I shouldn't use limited English proficient, but English language learners. It includes all of them, and I think it's important that we see what those needs are. This is the inequities, and what is it that we need to make sure we need to elevate everybody within their own, special needs populations. And so it's important to look at that. I know the federal government has not fully funded us the way we're supposed to in regards to that, but it's important for us to advocate, and so that way we could address those inequities.
Paul, could I add to that? Because I think the key to this is being asset-based, because too often policy stuff, we focus on the deficit that we need to fix, rather than seeing what is it that our students' abilities are, how do we leverage that? And if they have more than one ability that we need to focus on, let's make sure we're leveraging that in a positive way, because students who might have, learn differently, that there are opportunities for us to figure out how do we teach differently to make sure that that student and others are more embraced, and we leverage in a positive way what they bring to the table, rather than always saying what they don't have. That to me, it's a framing, and it seems simplistic, but it does fundamentally change how we look at what is equitable, rather than saying you're not the norm. To me, that's really big in our pedagogy, in our strategy, our public policy. Not being the norm should not be seen as something we're trying to fix. And having students with different abilities means that there are opportunities for us to look at what we've done in the past that made it look like a disability. How do we make them focus on the abilities they have? So I'll just add that to Armando's comment.
No, I think that's well said. And the acknowledgement that we in all of our work and our efforts have to be mindful of the term, inclusive, right? And how are we inclusive of all aspects of the identity and the needs of our Latinx students, and making sure that we are comprehensively responsive and not ourselves identifying the Latinx student as one singly defined type of student population. So with that, I want to take an opportunity, because I would be remiss if I didn't ask Melanie to speak a little bit to some research work that she has been doing with one of her colleagues, Jeremy. They've been working on a research brief focused on supporting Latinx students. And I think the question I want to ask Melanie as you speak about this is what has the experience shown you about the use and availability of data on Latinx students across ethnicity, across documentation status, gender, we're talking about this inclusivity of all students. And I'm wondering what you've learned through your research and what you might have to share on this point around Latinx students.
Definitely. And a big shout out to Jeremy. He has been an amazing partner throughout this entire process, and he has really done a lot of research. But I think what we have found is that the research presented is about Latinx/Hispanic students, but it's not very specific when we really digress and go deep into the research about what specific groups of Latinx students we are talking about. When we break it down by country of origin or by documentation status, there's just still gaps that are missing. And so as a student myself and talking with other individuals, we all understand that we have a wide variety of backgrounds. And when we try to kind of collect that research of how, how does my Mexican background differ from someone's Colombian background. I think that that is still really important research that needs to be collected in a really authentic way, because students, we are consistently asked to be surveyed, consistently asked to, do research. But I think that these blanket statements and blanket terms do not allow the opportunity for us to really understand the different backgrounds and communities that we are a part of. So I think a recommendation would definitely be to leverage kind of the communities that are in place in higher education systems, leverage the groups that are being made. I know that here at UNC, we have a group specifically for students from Brazil. We have Mi Pueblo, who encompasses a wide variety of students, but really leveraging and finding those pockets of students and hearing their stories is really important to understand, what specific groups need what.
So thank you, Melanie, and thank you for that work that you're doing, and your colleague Jeremy as well. I think you did a really nice job of speaking to, I think that key point of acknowledging the different types of Latinx student. Again, back to not any one single definition. And I know we've had a number of comments or questions from the audience that make reference to, and I'm going to ask the panel to speak to this a little bit, but it gets really to the point of even acknowledging sometimes the challenges of the terminology that we use, or the language, especially around identity, where we have with the US Census terms like Latino and Hispanic that are used interchangeably, yet maybe, creates a false assertion that everyone is the same, that every Latinx individual from that community background, speaks Spanish, which may not be the case, or whatever other assumptions might be in identity language. So I was wondering if the panel might speak a little bit to how in your work you incorporate the importance of understanding and sometimes the changing landscape of language, and how we make sure that we are not limiting or exclusionary or alienating, even just in the use of terminology and language. And I know, Melanie, you were speaking a bit to that about the different cultures within your own Latinx student population. I wanted to see if anyone wants to speak or has found their work really defined at all through the use of the terminology of how we describe our community and our student population.
Yeah, Paul, if you don't mind, I'll jump in. So again, I work at the national level, and we work across the country. And what I appreciate in this work is that we are continually evolving in how we define self as individuals, as groups, the circles, the intersection of who we are. At the national level, as I mentioned earlier, Latino is a political construct, right? Of people with different countries of origin. And the political construct is such that how do we get people to pay attention to subgroups in a way? What do you have? Do you have enough in common that you can bring as a broader polis, a way of understanding without minimizing the individual? And I think doing policy at scale means that you are trying to find common threads and link. So the beauty of this construct is what we make it. So we're talking about Latinx. I still deal with communities that want to use Hispanic. I want to bring country of origin. They want to say they're Chicano or Boricua or whatever those things are. And I think as long as we are comfortable and can identify how we want to be recognized, that creates an opportunity for us to engage rather than to minimize. Just like, you don't expect everybody from Georgia to be the same, or North Carolina, whatever their background is. How do we find commonality with the people that we're trying to engage with? And then frankly, from a numbers perspective, look, if you're going to use the political construct Latino, 2/3 of us are of Mexican descent. I am not. But, if we're going to talk at scale to try and get investment support, I think it's okay to talk about it in the aggregate, but then also find ways to show that there is diversity. And I think Latinos, we do that relatively well. If you watch Univision or Telemundo, one of the first things people say is they tell you the country of origin, but it's not intended to be divisive. It's intended to be descriptive. And I think that's an opportunity for us to talk about who we are in a way that isn't intended to be alienating, but we own as individuals. That's, I think, what institutions of higher education are having to grapple with. How do we deal with size and scale knowing that this is one individual, maybe even trying to define who and what they are, what they're choosing to embrace if they're second or third generation.
I'm going to steal your language, Deborah, in this whole idea of we're committed to continuing to evolve in how we define self along the way. I mean, it's just, I think that's a good open statement of continued growth and understanding that will serve all of us well. One of the other themes of a question we're getting from the audience is this idea of working across the full continuum. And maybe this is one more for Armando and Deborah, as well as Deborah works nationally, Armando works as a leader within both his school district, but also with school boards associations, both locally and nationally. The question really is, how do we engage across the full education continuum to support students and beyond just, I think as we're integrating a bunch of different types of questions, acknowledging that the support of our Latinx students and all students in general is beyond just the academic as well. It's the social, emotional, mental health, well-being of our students, especially through these unique times of a pandemic. And I'm wondering if there might be some observations that you all might share for our audience about how they should be thinking about getting engaged themselves. Where is there opportunity for them to work across the continuum? Any best practices you have to share? I think this is an opportunity to give some guidance to our audience members who want to and understand what this topic is all about, but might want to have specific ways of where they can engage or how they might be able to engage. So kind of your thoughts on that. Armando, can I ask you to speak first?
Yes.
Thank you.
As we know, professional development is critical and important for anybody, whether it's our teachers or whether it's our board members, right? From the top to the bottom, it's important for us to go look and get educated in what's going on in our community and outside of our community. So I highly recommend getting engaged if you're an educator or a board member, then you have the National School Board Association. In Texas, you have the Texas Association of School Boards, and then you have the Mexican American School Boards Association. And then at a national level, you also have NALEO, which is a National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. And here in those organizations, you're able to get some of the best practices as well as be able to build relationships with other individuals. So that way you can have those discussions across the country and to say, you know what is going on in El Paso? How were you able to address some of these issues and be able to build your capacity as an elected official or as an administrator? But it's important for us to continue to show growth, right? To see what earlier I made the comment on English language learners, and I go back to Deborah where we talked about deficits. So I made sure, I made sure that I didn't use that negative deficit or that connotation that they've labeled, right? And so for me, I've been able to grow personally, professionally, and I'm still continuing to grow. And I think it's important for anybody that's wanting to grow as an individual and wanting to understand our community to don't feel afraid to reach out to any one of us or in any one of our organizations and come join us. We're welcoming, we're loving people, and we want to make sure that we're all growing together. I hate when people make it seem like, oh, if we focus on, English language learners, or if we focus on, minority students, that we're going to neglect other students, and it's not that. So.
Yeah.
If I might, one of my understandings, Armando, is as a school board member, you were able to provide leadership to your school district that actually helped to create a partnership between the school district and the local community college. And I'm wondering if you might speak to that as a specific example of how, one, in a leadership role, you can make change happen, but in this case, establishing a real partnership between a traditional K-12 school district and a institution of higher education working together to provide dual credit opportunities for students, and how and why that's important.
Correct. One of the biggest things I take pride on is our Northwest Early College High School. We were a small school district, less than 5,000 students. We were the first one to actually do this and when it first started, and we were the 22nd campus in the state that actually created an early college. And what we were able to do is go back to those high expectations. And being such a small campus, people would say, oh, you know what, you don't have the amount of students that you need to actually get, the quality of students that are going to come out. And we had English language learners, we had SPED students, and we had different types of students that we were serving, and yet they were able to excel because we created that culture of high expectations, where now it's the second highest ranked high school in El Paso. It's the 77th in the state of Texas, and it's 492 in national rankings from US News and World Report. It's also a nationally blue ribbon school. And so what we were able to do with that culture of high expectations, and we were able to see the tremendous success, is how do we replicate this in a traditional school setting, right? As we know, if a student has 12 to 15 credit hours, more than likely they're going to be able to succeed and graduate from with an associate's degree or a university and or a doctoral program over the time. But we needed to look at how to expand this in our traditional high school. And the way we've done it is looking at stipends, looking at how do we support teachers to get more teachers certified to teach these classes. And my goal at the end of the day would be to your traditional high school, out of, you would require that 12 to 15 hours of dual credit coursework coming out of a traditional high school and or more. So there's a lot of work and ideas that can go about, but I think it's being able to build relationships and collaborate with other entities in your area. We did that with the community college, and the good thing is the community college also works well with our university to make sure that they support Latinx students.
Oh, could I add really quickly in there one thing? Because I want to support what Armando's saying is that, so we've got, there should be no excuses for inaction. That was your point about to take action. But rather than convincing people that we matter, I mean, we've seen there's so many people doing good work. We have to promote the good work. That's what people want. They want to know what's working. So I would suggest you take a look at the Growing Works database that Excelencia has, 16 years of tracking good work that's evidence-based, that's explicitly focused on Latino students. There's no reason for not taking action. And second, if you're an institution, the Seal of Excelencia, we've created a framework, how to capture intentionality with data, practice, and leadership. There's no excuse for not taking action. We've got structures. Armando mentioned some. We've been collecting them for years. There's a choice not to act if you're not willing to look at these organizations.
So we're starting to wind down on time. So I want to throw out just very quickly a couple of other topics that have come up from the audience to see if we might get some quick reaction. And one of the areas is a number of folks have sort of either asked questions or made statements about more of the national conversation that's taking place around what is described here in the question, the importance of culturally relevant instruction and exposure to the history of all races and ethnicities, not just a history of prominent white men. That's how it was written. So that's what I'm reading. And so the question, how are schools that support Latinx students really ensuring that students are learning the history of their cultures, and how does this differ across K-12 and higher education? And how should we be thinking about that space of this conversation? So just want to get some quick thoughts or reactions. Obviously, we can't go too deep in that in time, but I want to see how relevant that is and what points of view you might have. Melanie, I'm going to start with you as a student and see what your experience has been and what do you think about that question?
Yes, definitely. So I actually took a course here at UNC, Education 510, which is it's titled The Mexican Experience in Education, but it was taught by Ricky Hurtado, who is now serving in North Carolina General Assembly. And it was honestly a really great experience. It was the first time that I took a course that was specifically about my culture and my identity, and allowed me the space and platform to discuss kind of my upbringing and my experience in the K through 12 education system. And I think that it was incredibly important for me to realize why, why things were the way that they were. And it allowed me an academic perspective into my life that also facilitated my interest and gained me the knowledge to use that skills and apply it into further conversations, into policy briefs, into work that I do. I now also contact a lot of our congressmen and our governors about kind of the things that I've learned. I've also applied that learning more to my public high school, kind of reaching out to educators that I know and trying to kind of teach that. And so I think that providing these courses for students is incredibly important, but I also could see it being an incredible resource for educators as well, educators who are not Latinx, to understand my perspective, honestly, and my experience in the K through 12 system, and really learning what education as a Latinx student is and how our experiences differ from other groups, which I think is what our panel is trying to do. But I think that it's really important for all educators to understand how our experience is different.
Yeah, very well said. I'm going to see if either of the other two panels have any other quick comments or anything to add to what Melanie just shared.
No, I'll just jump in to say, I think we've been looking more at a culturally responsive pedagogy of being, because it's hard for people to feel like they're competent, given that our population, the definition continues to evolve, and that the majority of our teachers and faculty are not people of color. Means that there has to be an understanding about pedagogical approaches, how to be responsive without having to be fully knowledgeable about what it is, but to make sure that the education and the voice of the student gets articulated, because that's where it comes in. You can have academic rigor and bring the student's voice to apply it. And I think that's a critical way of thinking. And then I know I learned about my education, my background on my own. And I couldn't agree more that the opportunity to let others learn about the rich history of this country and the diversity that we have, that there should be a responsibility, kind of like Armando was mentioning in his comments as well.
Right. So I'm gonna keep us moving forward. I'm gonna acknowledge that one of the other questions, and we're not going to be able to get to it, but I want to acknowledge a point that the audience has made around as more and more Latinx students are graduating and achieving success. There's a point of how do we make sure that in the future we fully engage Latinx alumni and others to serve as mentors and thought partners and helping to better support students, Latinx students across the continued education journeys. And I think that's a point of emphasis that I think maybe we should all take to heart and acknowledge how important that might be. I want to kind of wrap up the panel's conversation. I want to give each panel member a quick opportunity. I think it's always important to end a conversation like this with hope. I think hope is powerful. And it's, because once we lose hope on any subject or any topic, then we truly have lost. And so as long as we have hope, there is opportunity. And so in that spirit of hope, I want to ask each of you to, if you have a sense of in the next 4 years or in the near term, what is the change you hope to see in terms of how we improve how we support Latinx students, or what outcome are you looking to see, or what's that big idea that you want to see happen around Latinx students? So that big change, that aspirational hope, what's that outcome, that milestone that most motivates you, that you would like to share with our audience? So Armando, may I start with you?
Yes. One of the things that I've realized that we have to do internally and externally is build capacity within our community. And it's important that we build that capacity now. We can't wait any longer. Internally, we've talked a lot about how we build that capacity within our students, but externally, in regards to these organizations across the country, we need to make sure that we're on the table and not on the menu, and making sure that our voices are heard and that we're able to articulate what needs to be done. So I think building capacity within my own community is to create a leadership program, so that way they get a better understanding of how my school district is, what's the governance model, what is their role as a community member, and how they can hold me accountable as a board member, and what can they do to make sure our superintendent's doing the right thing. So I think that type of leadership programs across That's something that I would like to work on at a state level as well. So I think it's important for us to build that capacity in our community.
Great. Melanie, let me ask for your thoughts.
Definitely. As a student, I think that education has been the past 15 years of my life. So I definitely think that this conversation is about investing in youth. And I definitely want to advocate for looking at education, not also higher education, but connecting the dots really early on. We need to make sure that we are serving students from the moment that they are eligible or enter the school system. And I think that there's a lot of awareness that needs to be brought about in those early stages, and how to best support Latinx students really early on, so that when they get the opportunity to get into high school to want to come into higher education, we can see some of those disparities close down. And I do think that this is a conversation that also needs to be had, at the early school stages. So I think that I will be focusing on kind of exploring that nuance, and I hope to write a senior honors thesis about that. So that will be my goal.
Plus, we have been trying to lobby Melanie to begin her gubernatorial campaign sooner than later. So hopefully that will be in her future as well. And we have hope for that. Deborah?
Yeah, I think our commitment is institutional transformation. We've got to build momentum for institutions to be different, to be places where Latinx students and other students thrive. And it shouldn't be assumed. It's got to be a given, and that means that I hope that we can be the change we want to see to make sure that our students are served well, and that means working in community. I mean, it's core to our community that you work in common cause. It takes all of us to do that. I'd love to work my way out of a job where this isn't an issue, because we're seeing that the equality of opportunity and the equity that needs to get addressed. So you gotta hope big, right?
Without a doubt. And so let me just thank our panelists. Let me conclude our panel conversation. Thank all of our panel members for their great insight. I would offer my own vision of hope, and really suggest that my hope is embedded in what we have seen today, in the fact that we have leaders like the panel members we have today. We have I think the ability and the opportunity to create that change that Deborah just spoke to do. I think we have an opportunity to change the education system in a manner that hopefully at some point in time, the education system serves our students, and it doesn't have to have a special focus. It doesn't require this energy and effort and work to transform institutions. That by definition, the systems are serving the students, all students, based on where they're coming from and what their needs are, with the one single-minded purpose of ensuring those students' success. So my hope is that our students will be ultimately served well by the institutions, regardless of any defining characteristics other than their passion for learning and their dreams of future success. And so I can see that, and I can see that with the leadership of the panel members today. The Hunt Institute and the work that it does in providing this type of leadership nationally. I want to thank them again for these webinars that I think so impactful and informative. So Senegal, let me thank you again for the opportunity for us to be a part of this panel, and turn it over to you for final comments, and thank you again.
No, thank you, Paul, for a beautifully moderated conversation. It's a pleasure to watch you work, and thank you to our panelists and to our attendees. So many great gems of wisdom that we're using these identities to be descriptive, not to be divisive. And as we're following the evidence and we're trying to make evidence-based decisions as policymakers, as educators, and as administrators, this Latinx population, this identity is a key one that we need to make sure is supportive, and that we're looking at their strengths, their abilities, their opportunities moving forward and setting the pace for growth. So again, thank you to our wonderful panelists, Melanie, Armando, Deborah, and Paul, for just an excellent conversation. Thank you to the wonderful team at the Hunt Institute behind the scenes who made this great event happen. And to our audience, we are always working on great content to make sure that you feel really informed, engaged, activated, and hopeful. So our next conversation this month is Transcending Party Lines, Collaboration in Education, with the Honorable Governor Chris Christie, Governor of New Jersey, David Axelrod, former Senior Advisor to President Obama and Director of the Institute for Politics at the University of Chicago, and the Hunt Institute's own President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, will be moderating that conversation. But again, we're so grateful for an awesome discussion with all of you today. Looking forward to seeing you on a Hunt Institute webinar soon.